Okay, folks, welcome back to Cedar Craft, our adventure learning Cedar together. Today, I think we'll go through and talk a little bit more about entities and this kind of interface they provide between your Cedar policies and the rest of your application. Um, and then we'll get into maybe how that can get a little bit more complicated and some resources Cedar provides to make it easier to ensure you wrote your policies correctly and that they're doing what you think they're doing. So just to recap, we've kind of been on this journey learning Cedar. We saw how to use the Python bindings, which are pretty easy to get up and started with, nice for going through tutorials, etc. And then last time we started talking about entities. And so the problem we had was that if we just use really simple policies, like explicitly say for every principal, resource, and action what is allowed, we end up with a huge number of policies, right? So it's going to be pretty annoying. We have to change our policy all the time. It kind of blows up, right? So here, for every user and image pair in like a hypothetical photo application, we've had to add those. That does work. And one thing I wanted to mention is that if you do write policies this way, you don't actually need to talk about the properties, the attributes of entities at all, right? Everything that Cedar needs to make a decision in this style is going to be present in the request, right? We're not talking about entities at all. So to show that, here we have this, basics.py, and we have a couple of requests down here. So we're going to say, oh, well, if Alice wanted to view tree, would that be allowed? If Bob wanted to view mountain, would that be allowed? And if we run those, we see, sure enough, both those requests are allowed. But if we come back to the application, we had this sort of snapshot of the entity store here. If we delete all this, those requests are still going to go through just fine. Let's delete them actually. Right, so now we don't have any entities. Let's save that and run again. And what do you know? Those decisions are both actually still allows. And that's because the policy doesn't need to look at anything about entities in order to, render a decision. But, last time we were pretty unsatisfied with needing to write a policy like this. A policy is going to explode. It's going to be hard to think about at a high level. So we saw that using the entity store and attributes on the entities can make our policies much, much simpler. So here, for example, we've reduced all those policies to this really simple single policy where we say we're going to permit any principal to view any resource when that principal is in the resource's viewers, right? So this is a policy that's easy to understand. But what we needed to do to make that work was to sort of represent the state of the application in the entity store. And so we had a couple of users, and we added photos, and we put the viewers of each photo here, right? And so that works out, I think the way we ended up was Alice and Bob can view tree, and sort of Alice can view everything else. And if we see, can Alice and Bob view the tree, let's run that real quick. What was that called? Attributes. There we go. Those are both allowed. But if we ask, can they both view mountain.jpg and run that, Alice is still allowed. She's listed on every single photo. Bob's only listed on tree. So his decision is denied. He can't do that. So, this is a step in the right direction. You might be concerned that we replaced a bunch of policies instead with a bunch of entities and entity attributes. But actually, this is still a win because the entities are computed from your application state, right? So whenever you make a request, anytime you send a request to Cedar, you're going to send along those entities, and that's going to be like almost like a database view, right? A projection of your application state. It's kind of the interface from your application state to Cedar. So that will be done automatically, and we get this nice high-level policy that's easy to reason about. So the thing I wanted to talk more about today was kind of enriching that representation of your actual application state and point out some things that can kind of get tricky potentially as you go along, and see in next week tools Cedar provides to make that easier. So one thing we can see right away here immediately is, suppose that we screwed up our policy and we kind of had a type error. Instead of seeing whether or not the principal was in the viewers of the resource, we check to see if the resource was in the viewers of the principal. Now, our principals, I keep making that typo. Caught it early this time. Our principals don't have a viewer's attribute, right? So this policy doesn't even really make sense, right? Principals here, our users, have no attributes. But if we run this, it'll run just fine and just say both of these are denied, when really we kind of expected Alice to be allowed, but that's not what the policy says anymore. So we want validation to help us check that out. So one thing that we'll go into, I think next week, is the Cedar policy validator, and that'll help us catch these kinds of mistakes by allowing us to really precisely describe the relationship between the state of the application the policies depend on and what the policies are doing. But to give a flavor for how we might, get more and more interesting and useful model of that relationship between the application state, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into entities and look at this example here in the groups file. So the policy we have here is actually the same. We say we're going to permit principal to view any resource when it's in that resource's viewers. But we've changed how this works. And in particular, although this is, the attribute style was already easier, as we mentioned, right, we are adding individual viewers to every resource, right? So each photo, we're listing all the users that can view that photo. In real applications, things that people typically would actually build, you're going to not have this kind of mapping directly from users to every photo, right? We're not going to make this list for each individual photo. It's going to be pretty tedious. Instead, what people tend to do is introduce a layer of indirection and have some kind of group, right? So we'd often have users belong to different groups, and then have photos point to the groups that can view that photo, right? And this works out because there's typically a ton of users and a relatively small number of groups and photos. So we're going to save a lot of effort doing it that way. So let's see how we might start to model something like that in Cedar. So again, we're actually not going to change our policy here. Well, we're going to add to it in a second, but at first we'll start off with the same. And instead what we've done is we've added another kind of entity. We have these user groups now in the entities, and we have a user group of nature lovers and a user group of administrators. And we've added another user, Emma, here, who's an admin. Alice is in the group nature lovers, and Bob is not in any groups. So if we go down and make a request, we also need to update the attributes for photos. So now instead of photos having users as their viewers, photos have user groups, right? So we say tree can be viewed by anybody in the nature lovers group. And in fact, we've done that for each of these photos because they're all kind of nature related. So if we go down and look at a request, we would expect Alice to be able to view any of these photos because she's in the nature lovers group, and Bob not to be able to view any because he's not in any groups. So let's check that real quick. So this is groups.py. I'm going to run those policy checks. And sure enough, Alice is allowed and Bob is denied. But there is something else that's interesting. So if we go back up to our users here, we see that we put Emma in the admin group. So intuitively, we might expect Emma to be able to access anything. But if we check by putting Emma here for mountain and make another policy decision, Emma's denied, right? And this really shouldn't be surprising. Of course, the policy doesn't say anything about what admins are allowed to do. So let's add a policy here, and I've kind of Martha Stewarted this, pull it right out of the oven. So here we're saying any principal can perform any action on any resource when they're in the user group admin. And this might be too permissive for your application. This is just sort of a simple example to illustrate the point. But now that we've added this policy, this second policy, Emma should be able to access that photo. So let's check that. Sure enough, now Emma can access it, and Alice can still, of course, access. She's still in the nature lovers group. But what we've done is we've sort of enriched our the types of things that our policies talk about. Now, instead of just talking about users and photos, we can also talk about groups. And we have this relationship where users are in groups and photos have user groups as the entities they give permission to. And so now when we're checking things, we really want to check, is the principal in the group that is the viewers that are allowed for that resource? Or we want to check, is the principal in the group of administrators? And so, as we enrich the entity store, there's sort of more and more mistakes we can make. We already talked about the one where we swapped the principal and resource. Here, maybe you might say resource instead of principal, right? And these are things that validation will help us check. So I think we'll look into that next time. But the big picture is, Cedar's, one of the fantastic things about Cedar is that it's really expressive. It allows us to model in a nice fine-grained way what application state is relevant to authorization decisions, and then automatically slice that state out and send it along with our requests. So pretty stoked for that, and we'll get to see some exciting command line tools as well when we start playing with validation. Looking forward to sharing more about Cedar with y'all, and have a great day.